Welcome, everyone. I'm Kimberly from the Country Bookshop, and I would like to begin by thanking each one of you for joining us either now or later in time to watch this virtual event with Hugh Eakin. Oh, Hugh, I meant to ask how the correct way to pronounce your last name.
I think you said it right. It's Hugh Eakin.
Hugh Eakin. Okay.
Thank you.
The Country Bookshop is part of our town for one reason and one reason only, because you choose to shop with us. We hope that you're proud to shop with us, whether it be because you enjoy the opportunities we provide for discovery, either on our shelves or over the computer like this, or the experiences we provide, like in meeting authors like James Patterson or Amor Towles or Scott Pelley or Christy Woodson Harvey in person. We're proud of the work we do in getting books in kids' hands across Moore and our surrounding counties. Or maybe you enjoy shopping with us just to keep it so that you have a place to bring your family when they visit. Either way, we thank you for finding the Country Bookshop to be of value to you in our town. And we appreciate that you acknowledge our value to the community by buying your books from us. The Country Bookshop was founded by two women in 1953, and the store has had several longtime owners over the years. In 2010, when the bookshop's doors were closing, the Pilot newspaper bought the store. If you have not visited us in downtown Southern Pines, please do. Although we enjoy serving you from wherever you are, we hope that you take the time to enter our doors. It is my great pleasure to open up our time together today by introducing our guest of honor. Hugh Eakin is a senior editor at Foreign Affairs. He has written about museums in the art world for the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and the New York Times. During his career, he has reported from Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and other countries in the Middle East. Hugh has been extraordinarily patient with us at the Country Bookshop as we've had to postpone this event about his fascinating book, Picasso's War, How Modern Art Came to America, published earlier this month by Crown, and it has received accolades and attention from across the landscape. So welcome, Hugh, and thank you so much.
So glad to be here.
Well, good. Well, so the book is in two parts, but I'm hoping to really focus on the first part since many of our attendees might not have read the second part. But in this book, so much you're correcting the loss of kind of the clarity in history about how America ended up embracing the art of Picasso and his contemporaries. But so much about the book is a study in the scaffolding of a market that allowed for the artistic freedom. And I want to start by I'm so curious, first of all, what made you first look at John Quinn, and understand that he needed to be explored? How did you stumble across him and be like, this guy is fascinating?
John Quinn is an amazing figure, and he's amazing for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that I think almost no one knows about him today. And
not anymore, you fixed it.
Even people who have studied this period, he's been relatively neglected, and that has to do with the fact of what happened to his estate. He was this incredible letter writer. He knew all these people in the cultural world, in the political world. He was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. He knew W.B. Yeats, just an incredible person who was kind of in the background of all these events, but was not really remembered today. And he left this remarkable record of letters, and over many, many years of his career. And I was able to study those letters really carefully. And it just became immediately apparent to me that this one person would tell the story of an entire era that we actually don't understand that much about today, or at least I didn't. And I wanted to use his story to tell that larger story.
When did you first hear his name?
That's a good question. Well, I sort of work backward in time. So from the period of the book runs for listeners who haven't looked at it yet. It sort of starts at the beginning of the 20th century and goes up until World War II, ends in the World War II era. And I was doing this research on Picasso and one of his dealers, and I learned that one of his dealers had had all these contacts with this mysterious American figure who had the greatest Picasso collection in the world. And I just thought, wow, that's amazing. How could that have been that in 1920, the person who had the most amazing Picasso collection in the world is just completely forgotten today. And so that kind of led me on this trail of trying to figure out who he was.
I'm so curious about, well, we can go into that in a moment, but the shock of it, and you do such a good job illustrating that contrast of, okay, this collection exists and it's in America, because you do such a good job creating the landscape that Quinn would have been operating in that time in American society. And the juxtaposition is so striking. Can you talk a little bit about that landscape, like J.P. Morgan, what was happening at the cultural institutions of the time, where their focus was?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I like to think of the book, it's kind of like you have to do an act of time travel to get back into this completely different world. And, we're used to thinking of, oh, Picasso, one of his paintings sold for $67 million 2 months ago. This is like the idea of him not being a superstar and not being just this huge overwhelming cultural figure is hard to imagine. But we go back in time far enough and we're in a completely different United States. And the United States of John Quinn, he's this self-made man who arrives in New York City as a young man. He's a brilliant lawyer, and he's just fascinated by contemporary culture. And yet at that time in New York, there really wasn't much interest in new culture. There was an obsession with art. Art was so important, but it was J.P. Morgan and his friends. The art that they wanted was old art. They were emulating the princes of the Renaissance. They wanted to have the same artworks that, the Medici had, and actually literally would pursue collections in Europe that had that pedigree going back for centuries. And so Quinn comes along and he has this completely different idea. And he says, that's dead art. We should be supporting the new art of today. And this as a cultural concept just wasn't widely shared at the time. And so he was really kind of fighting he was kind of having a cultural insurgency to say, look, you have to, that we can't be a new country. We can't be a leading power in the world by just imitating the past. We've got to move into the future. And so he has very much like a whole philosophy underpinning his ideas about art and collecting. And at the time, he's really out there because there's not a lot of support for this. People think modern art is crazy. It's deviant. It doesn't have cultural prestige. It's also kind of dangerous. You read these critics at the time or what people reacted, they really thought it was dangerous. These were dangerous influences coming in. And Quinn was saying, no, this is the new, this is the future. And he really had a vision of building a new American culture out of this.
Well, I mean, it goes to the thoughts. I mean, your book, part of what fascinated, I have so many questions, the thinking and how that thinking moves from the fringes into the center and how consistent it was. I was struck with the J.P. Morgan factor in building the collection, because I'm familiar with how he built his manuscript collection and where it totally parallels his art collection. The old War masters copying the Medici's book, buying the Medici's book collection, certain chunks, and then recognizing also that Quinn, before he really got interested in the visual arts, he was in this modern thinking world with the writers and these Irish rebel writers on the fringe and collecting those manuscripts. And I thought that was fascinating because it was interesting where his mind was primed for seeing in what these artists kind of on the edges of thinking were seeing. And, you know, you talk about, I'm kind of moving forward in my questions here, that the fact that there was no market, and it's almost like through his efforts, he kind of finds this constellation of people to then help prepare the American market for what's to come, you know, 20 years later. Can you talk a little bit about some of these people? And let me rewind a little bit and say, and so before we can go back to Quinn, who I just think is fascinating, but I think to touch on Rosenberg's way of presenting Picasso and his contemporaries and how he chose to show that. And is it Kahnweiler? My pronunciation, I'm like Southern.
Yeah, Kahnweiler. Yeah.
Okay, Southern and Kahnweiler, and how, okay, they're also, you know, dealing with these artists, fascinating, but you talk in the book about how they each have two different methods of bringing these artists to the culture. And can you explain those, and then we can go back to Quinn?
Yeah, so this is, so just to understand, so Kahnweiler and Rosenberg are the two major art dealers associated with Picasso. I mean, there were various dealers who were dealt with Picasso, but Kahnweiler is kind of the early discoverer and supporter of Picasso when he's doing Cubism and up until World War I. And then Rosenberg, who becomes a major figure in this story, is the dealer who works with Picasso from World War I all the way to World War II, and kind of makes him into, in some ways, what we know as this, you know, very successful, as well as this artistic genius who also is able to get kind of international acclaim. And so they had these two different visions. And, you know, Kahnweiler is this amazing, for like Quinn in the United States, Kahnweiler is in Paris, has this amazing foresight, and he sees these new artists, and he doesn't care if there's no popular approval for this. He really identifies this movement as a major revolution in 20th century art, and he collects all of these artists. So he has Picasso, he has Braque, he has a bunch of the so-called Fauvist artists, Andre Derain, and he collects these artists who today we identify as sort of the major figures of the Paris school, and he has them in his gallery. But his whole approach is not to try to build a mass audience. He thinks that the only way to get support for this radical new art is to find sort of a small group of kind of connoisseur collectors who, and he's really successful. So he has a kind of boutique, I call it a sort of a boutique, international boutique business, and he's selling to, he has clients in Moscow and in Germany, and he's very much looking towards Europe. He doesn't really think of the United States at all, because he just doesn't see any potential, which is so hard for us to imagine today. You know, no one in America is buying this exciting new stuff. And then Quinn is kind of the exception to that, and he becomes the kind of lone figure in this era who's buying it. And then Rosenberg steps in, and he has a whole different approach, and he says, no, you can actually change public taste. And he wants to do this as kind of, he's a great showman, and he opens this huge gallery that would be like one of the major galleries in New York today. I mean, they put on really big shows. He hires art historians to write the introduction to his shows and to curate them. And he builds all this market power by selling more conventional or more accepted 19th century art, which supports his business. And then he invests that in this more radical new art, which he knows won't immediately find public approval, but he can support it. And that allows him to be at the forefront while still kind of running this big enterprise and also bringing it to a much bigger public. And he has this funny thing where he says, like, well, he had a 2-story gallery, and he had this idea that you led people in through the Renoirs and the Monet on the first floor, and then you'd get up to Picasso on the second floor. You'd be sort of acclimatized, and he'd say, well, come on, have a look at this. So it was really interesting to see these two approaches really contrasting, and they're sort of clashing through that entire period. And it's not clear which is going to win. Like Rosenberg really struggles, even though he's put all this money into it, he really struggles. And then Kahnweiler has this huge success, but he has other problems. I don't want to give it away in the book, but it's as if he's made a huge bet on these artists, and it almost all comes down. And I'm not going to give it away.
Blinders.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. And what struck me what I find the most interesting about Kahnweiler is this German and Russian market, knowing, through your book, how primed the audience has to be to think on the fringes, and, to know that thinking's there, which you kind of already know it's there, but then what forces are to come to clamp down on, like, politically on these people who exist, who are thinking way outside of the box, and in that kind of, I don't know, gymnastics thinking hasn't happened in America yet, and America's so far behind. I don't know, there's so much in this book. I really, part of why I'm so excited to have this conversation is that I think this is going to be a great nonfiction book club book. What I cannot wait to bring this book to all of our people, because there's so many conversations to be had, or supplementary things to explore. It's just these tendrils into everything. And when we think about what's happening in America with Quinn, and this, you use the term cultural advocacy, which I just love thinking about the humans who make that possible. And you talk about his tremendous energy and kind of this force of passion, but it also comes down, it's really key that he has this passion for these new ways of thinking and the artistic ways that's coming to the forefront. But the fact that he's a lawyer is so key.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the ways that, starting when he was into books, but like he needed to be a lawyer and have this be his pro bono, his legal expertise was paramount.
Yeah, no, that's right. And it seems so, so serendipitous that here you have a guy who works on Wall Street, self-made, he works his way up. He's a brilliant finance attorney. So his day job is like, he works for the stock exchange for one of the major national banks. And this is really kind of, old school financial law, but his passion is all this new, exciting new culture that's happening. And first, it's literature, and he gets on to this Irish, the kind of Irish literary renaissance. It's happening at the turn of the century. And he sees that as not just exciting new literature, but he really sees it as a cultural change. And Ireland's such a good case for that, because the leaders of the Irish Renaissance were really trying to build a new country. They were asserting, this is all the buildup to the Irish independence movement, which Quinn is really involved in, because he's an Irish American immigrant. Both parents, he's not an immigrant himself. Both of his parents immigrated in the 19th century. So he has this Irish background. He's very close to that. And so that provides a way for him to see how culture can be used to build a new nation, and it very much kind of becomes a guiding thing for him. But as this lawyer, as to your question, it gives him a really important tool that helps him in so many ways. And I mean, just to give a few examples, I mean, censorship is a really big thing in the early 20th century, and especially in New York. There is an anti-vice squad, and they're actually Anthony Comstock was this famous postal inspector who actually got laws enforced about what you could circulate in the mail, and it's mainly aimed at.
I think a lot of our readers are going to be familiar with this, as there's a lot of women's history that Comstock, women's health movements and women's suffrage.
Yeah.
That was where if any of our listeners or readers have heard of that, that may be where they've encountered it before. Just to interrupt. Sorry, please.
So every time he was funding a lot of writers like James Joyce or Wyndham Lewis. He was friends with Ezra Pound, and all of these new writers were writing really daring new, the whole modernist canon was a new style of writing, but also they were dealing with subjects that really were kind of considered, this wasn't, you were breaking conventions to talk about certain things. And like he brought the Abbey Players, which was this famous Irish repertory theater. Quinn brought them to America, and they're performing this very provocative Irish play by Sign. It's called The Playboy of the Western World, and it's a famous play today, but at the time it was heavily censored, and he has to go and defend them in court because the entire cast of this play were arrested in Philadelphia. And so he's doing this over and over again. He has to go to court to essentially defend the artists and writers that he believes in. And he has to go to Washington to get the laws changed about how modern art is taxed. And that's, again, he's using his legal expertise to provide this new way for art to come into the United States because there was a heavy tax on art in all these different ways.
And what I love in the way you present it, because you in looking at this man who is interested in these new way of thinking, and then you talk about his legal arguments. I mean, like he's almost like using this mental dexterity that he's learned, that all these people have taught him, to defend these artists against the conservative and this really closed mindset that has created these legal structures. And specifically how he takes the campaign and how he argues and convinces everybody for this import tax. It's brilliant. And I love how you draw the line from these radical ideas to how he sets it up and how he's using them. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about what that argument specifically was that he used against Congress, or to convince.
Well, this is a really interesting moment, and so this is right before World War II. Woodrow Wilson has just been elected, and one of Wilson's major campaign pledges is tariff reform. So this is a big issue in this era, and so there've been these really high protectionist taxes on all sorts of imports, and so he wants to reform this. And it's aimed at the big industrial goods, and this is a big progressive era idea. And it's so important to Wilson that even before he comes to office, he assigns Congress to start working on this new legislation. So this is January 1913. Wilson hasn't even taken office yet, and this new committee in Congress is writing the legislation. And John Quinn in New York has these connections in Washington, and he sees this opportunity and he says, okay, now we can deal with this terrible tax, which is, there's a tax uniquely on modern art, which even though, I think few people would remember that today, but at the time it was such a marginal thing that, the big collectors like JP Morgan were buying historic art, and they had lobbied earlier to get rid of taxes on art that is older than 50 years old. And so Quinn's point is, well, how can you leave this tax on everything new and take it off everything old? But he knew that in Congress this was not going to be a popular idea, because no one cared about this.
And it's so radical. It's like everybody doesn't know what to do with it. They would not get that.
Well, exactly. And if he talked about the specific artists that he was interested in, that would just make it worse, because these are controversial.
They're rabble rousers. They're trouble causers.
Exactly. And so he puts together this amazing campaign, which is really just a one-man campaign. And he pulls all his friends together, and he realizes that the real argument is art as education, and art, don't talk about modern art or old art, just all art should be free. And he calls it the free art campaign. And museums love this. And so like the Metropolitan Museum, which is extremely conservative at the time, in fact, JP Morgan is actually the chairman of the Metropolitan Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum has no interest in this new art. They wholeheartedly support his campaign because it's about free art. And he gets universities involved, university presidents, and it's a national campaign. And eventually it gets down to the House of Representatives supports it. He's got his allies there, but the Senate is pushing back. And there's a moment when the Senate is going to even make a harsher law, raise the tax. And he organizes this newspaper campaign. And this is like typical Quinn. He has all these friends in the media, and he realizes that modern art is very cheap, and it's really the only art that an ordinary person could go out and buy. And whereas this historic European art is, this is the age of an art boom, and Morgan and his friends are paying $500,000, which is at the time, which is today would be tens of millions of dollars for these Rembrandts and Velázquez's and Holbeins. And so Quinn says, why are we giving all these super wealthy tycoons a tax break and then taxing the ordinary man? And this becomes such a popular argument. And so all these newspapers run editorials like accusing the Senate of elitism. And finally, they just say, okay, sure. And they change the law. And then the sort of the crowning point is that Quinn himself actually writes the law.
I love this. And you say in the book, you're like, and he went down to Washington, even just because it was the day of the vote. And to me, that spoke to Quinn just following his nose and having that knack for just, whether in his mind or physically, just being at the right place. And because he was there.
Yeah. And so he develops this friendship with the head of this congressman who is writing the legislation. And at the end, when the Senate caves, the congressman just says, Quinn, you know this better than anyone. You write the art paragraph. And that's not there's another occasion during the war when again he writes legislation that he becomes that he's very interested in. So this is just one example of how he's using his legal skills and his political network to put this
well, he's just chipping away at the barriers as America is not prepared. He's just chipping away so that when the people, the community is finally ready to think and to be receptive to a different way of reflecting on the world than they were prepared to before. It's ready for them. But we talk about his network and him like activating his network in different ways and using it. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about reading his correspondence and what that was like, because I can only imagine his letters. You talk a little bit in the book about him calling in the secretaries and taking his commentary on a book. And I think about, when I discover a great book, I write it and then I copy it in different emails to different people and I have it, read this book. And then here's, my little piece in it. And I'm wondering what it was like, where you sat to go through his correspondence, what it was like to hold those letters, what it is, the stuff that just, you can tell us because you're sitting here talking to us right now, but please, take us there. It's fascinating.
No, it's a great part of the story. And it was a discovery to me. I mean, even when I started to become interested in him, I just had no idea how much documentation was there. I mean, here was a guy who wrote like, a dozen letters a day. And this is the heyday of, he actually talks about this. I think early in his career is when, I forget what the name of the paper was at the time, but the carbon copies came in and typing. And so because he's a lawyer, he works with secretaries, he can dictate. And so he dictated all of these letters. Almost all of them are typed, and which is also amazing because you don't have to decipher handwriting. And he could dictate these 20-page letters. They often did run to 18 to 20 pages. And the output, and these are to people all over the world, but the number of the sheer number of major figures, they crop up in these pages, like a French philosopher like Henri Bergson, or any number of politicians in Washington, to all of these writers and cultural figures, and then artists. And it was so important to him not just to support new books and new art, but he wanted to be friends. He wanted to have a personal contact with the artists he supported. And he really, during the war, he's writing all of these French artists who are fighting in the trenches. And so the experience of reading these letters really brings you, even sort of sometimes day by day, what he's doing. And he'll have a dinner party and there'll be a kind of play-by-play. The next day he's writing some friend who wasn't there about like what was said, who came, who told the best jokes. And the other thing that is really current, as you said, so at a certain point he has so much correspondence that he's always behind on, that he started, he'd devote his Sunday afternoons to catching up. And he used to bring 2 or sometimes 3 secretaries to his house, and he would sit at the table and he would dictate sometimes multiple letters simultaneously. And he had this strategy, as you said, where he had read some book or he had seen a play, or there was some political event that he wanted to share his thoughts on to multiple people, and he would kind of develop a paragraph that he would drop into 3 different letters. So it was just fascinating. And then the other thing was he also used telegrams all the time, especially when he was buying art. So he would be, sometimes hour by hour, you'd be able to follow, like he's offered a painting in Paris and he gives his answer. And then, his agent in Paris says, no, but you should do this. And then, so that was really exciting to me, to be able to recreate what he was thinking on a particular day, who he was talking to, and how his ideas developed over time.
So many people, as this book is being discovered and explored and read, talk about the pacing and the readable nature and the mystery, and it understanding that kind of material makes you understand how you can create that sense of drama and closeness to the subjects. We're nearing the end of our time, which kills me because Hugh, I could talk. I'm so into this, and I'm so just grateful for you to write this. There's so much here to unpack. And one of the things this is just one paragraph, but I thought it was very interesting. As Quinn they brought the Armory show, and through that they identified what I think of as like the little constellation stars, luminaries who will help propel modern art, bring modern art to America in the future. But I thought it was really interesting. You talk about the female leaders of like the different progressive social movements and how their minds were just ripe to think and understand this mission. And I was wondering, and I know it's only a paragraph in the book, but I was wondering if you could speak at all to that, because I think it's something that many of our readers might be intrigued by, as there's so many books focused on the female leaders of those social movements now.
Yeah, no, that's a terrific insight there, because that actually there's a much larger story there. And first of all, I should also say that, while Quinn was this kind of amazing figure himself, his companion, who is important in the story, Jean Foster, is equally amazing to me, and also equally sort of unknown and forgotten. And so she, I'll leave it to the book, but just really briefly. So she comes from this super humble background. Her father is a lumberjack. She grows up in the Adirondack Mountains, and she kind of lands on the scene at the same time as Quinn. And she also has this passion about Irish literature and modern art, and they eventually come together. And so that was just one way that I think Quinn did understand that actually women in New York society were this progressive force moving against this kind of conservative establishment. And at the time of the Armory show, there are these group of women who are just amazing. And one of them who's really interesting is Mary Rumsey. And she is the daughter of E.H. Harriman, who's this railroad baron. So hugely wealthy, but she's kind of a radical. So she's the founder of the Junior League at a really young age. And she has this idea that women can come together and be kind of a force for like social housing and all of these really kind of modern causes about reforming society, addressing inequality. And she comes to art, and she's actually married to this sculptor who's an American sculptor. And they have this kind of great, it reminds me of like Great Gatsby, because they have this kind of charmed existence, but they're also, it's a very fast life. And she's very interested in the new art. And there's this moment when Quinn is hopeful that he can enlist these women to actually build like kind of a museum. And it's as if he's anticipated the Museum of Modern Art. He's like 15 years too early, but he basically has the right concept, because that's eventually what does happen. And you can read the book to find out, but it is a group of women who come together and basically say that, we're stuck in the past. We have to move forward. And so I think he really was able to harness that force. So the difficulty for me was to keep it narrow. I mean, there are so many interesting characters in this story.
I know. And I mean, you touched on it, and I keep scrolling through. Oh, I have like 4 more pages of questions that we're just not going to get to. But when you talk about Foster, and now I've, of course, scrolled away, she to me is the gift that you've given. And one of my questions, because I'm so intrigued by her, and the fact I noticed that some of the quotes you had a couple of quotes from her that specifically as she's in Europe, as the war is starting, and she's seeing paintings and all this. And this quote that struck me: one seemed before to live outside history. Suddenly history in the making is everywhere. And all of a sudden she can't see art. And I realized you had access to her diary.
Yes. Yeah. This was amazing. Like amazing.
I mean, which to me, I'm like, yes, someone is going to explore her and write her. And we're going to like, she's now not going to be lost because you found this. What was her diary like?
Well, I mean, there was so much there, but the intersection of her life with world events. And so she's this amazing figure who becomes basically a journalist. And she's a really successful literary journalist. She's sent to Europe by this magazine to cover social movements and to write about some of the same Irish writers that Quinn was interested in, to the art in Paris. She reviews the Armory show. She's one of the only critics in the United States who actually gets it. She goes there and she understands what's going on. And then the war starts, and suddenly she's a war correspondent. I mean, literally, she's caught in London at the moment war breaks out. And so that was a moment where it was especially to be able to see her diaries and to know what she was sort of thinking at the time. And how does that moment hit, someone who has all this cultural experience, but suddenly it's been, it's crashed into this global war. And the same thing was happening meanwhile in France, where these artists, leading this art revolution, this kind of beautiful life. They just thought, they had Kahnweiler supporting them and weren't really worried about whether they sold paintings or not. Suddenly it was, they're being called to fight. And so it's like art suddenly becoming a life and death struggle. But these were exciting moments. And again, I'm just privileged to be able to have had that material to tell the story.
I mean, the whole book is such a gift. I'm obviously a huge fan. But it's interesting too. And I am not talking about, as you just mentioned, having Kahnweiler support them. And what came through to me is this, looking at this scaffolding of creating markets and dealers and making it possible and setting up that existence where these artists could feed themselves, could live, because they were selling their work. And to what came through to me, although I don't know if you elaborate on that, is because of this economic scaffolding and exploring this market at the time, these artists were able to create in ways that they would not likely not have necessarily been able to explore had they had to feed their kids by doing like portraits that they would have to sell that day.
Yeah. No, that's a great, I mean, this is actually, you're getting at one of the really big themes for me in the book, which is freedom, and this idea that kind of, I mean, it's more, it unfolds in the second half of the book, but as the politics of the time become so fraught, and you have the rise of fascism, the rise of totalitarianism in Russia and in Germany, and these are the countries that, as we talked about earlier, they were actually ahead in the cultural thing, and suddenly they're going the other way. So this idea of artistic freedom is so important, especially as the 30s lead into World War II. And I think it really does start there, that, Kahnweiler had this vision of like total liberation. These guys are geniuses. I'm just going to pay them I mean, he didn't pay them a huge amount, but it was enough that they could do what they wanted to do. And he saw that this was a new, and he wasn't at the time. I mean, he had his clients who were buying it, but a lot of what he was storing, and he had inherited some wealth, and he just decided this is the future and I'm all in. And that was it's a really exciting idea to think that, at the base of this was not just a new kind of art, but a new idea about creativity, that it could just be total liberation.
Yeah, it's the whole thing, and it's why this book is so powerful. And it goes into the fact that it's not just the artist. I've been looking at re-examining the art, but it's not just those who are creating, it's supporting those who are thinking and creating. And I keep saying the word scaffolding, but the structures, the structures are just humans making, chipping away at barriers, or paying, or creating markets, or bringing ideas to just ignite, bars thinking, or all these humans that will carry these ideas forward. And as we near the end of our time, I think it's interesting, you coming to this book from what little research I was able to do about you. You've reported on political change and art and immigration and social change. And it's so interesting that you're writing this book a century later now. And I just am wondering, as you are looking at this book and researching it in today's time, kind of what your thinking was. And there are a lot of, I'm not going to make this question a sharp, direct question, but I'm just wondering where your thoughts were and what you were thinking about and where you were looking in the modern time as you were writing this and researching.
Well, I think that, one of the things that really interested me, having thought, I've also been engaged in like international politics and sort of the way different, I'm really interested in how political forces change culture, and how, how different, different countries at different points in time are either, global powers or, global enemies. And I was so interested, which was really counterintuitive to me, that, that flip we talked about of czarist, this is Russia under the Tsar, is one of the most advanced art scenes in the world. And, to the point that even in Europe, people traveled to Moscow, rather than Paris, because in Paris, the artists that was where the art was coming from, but they weren't really showing it there. They were sending it to Moscow, which in other ways we might have thought of as, oh, it's this backwards old country, but it had this very vibrant art culture. And the same thing about Germany. So this was Wilhelmine, this is the, Imperial Germany before World War I, had all of these museums. They had this idea that the public should have access to contemporary culture. There were all these art societies. And in some ways, Germany was very modern, even though its political system was not. And so that sort of clash just fascinated me. And meanwhile, we have this idea of, and that, the United States was this rising economic power. It had, it was fast becoming this sort of industrial leader of the world. And yet culturally, it was still kind of figuring out, where it was. And, I love these, I didn't have time for this in the book, and I'm probably not even answering your question, but, reading that period, like if you go back and read like Edith Wharton, House of Mirth, there are these great scenes where she captures the passion of that time period for art. I mean, art in some ways was more important than it was today. We didn't have, there was no, you couldn't buy illustrations. You had to actually own paintings. And so access to art was, it brought all this prestige, it brought social prestige. And, I was just thinking of her book because there's a scene where a group at a party, women are dressing up as characters in different paintings. But the paintings were like, these were like, Van Dyck or Bellini. So the idea that was happening at the same time that like Picasso was doing his, breakthrough work, it kind of makes you understand both that the US was, utterly obsessed with art, but also in a completely different orientation than what we think of today, where modern art is just, the sort of center of the universe. So I guess I didn't really, I just
no, but it gets to, I mean, you ignited so many things in my brain as I was reading this. I mean, just looking at Russia and Germany at that time, right before this huge clampdown, what was happening in those countries, and just reminding me of where this as things get polarized, and as people go extreme one way, there's also people going extreme the other, and one just happens to go. And when you look at this reception to this art and this thinking and this lunatic fringe, as Roosevelt calls it, where that's understood and being received is also where, when we know what happens next in the historical timeline. I mean, there's so much that you give us in this book, and I could tell, you are just fascinated by so much, and I think that perspective is what makes this book so powerful. And it's I think about like graffiti in the 80s and 90s that now is people are finally like looking at, but then it was just trash. And
Right.
And it was interesting last night as I was chatting with a friend about this book and just everything else, and she has a book coming out about North Carolina artists, today's North Carolina artists, and the history of making sure North Carolina is a state of culture. Not that we've told anybody outside of the state about it, but those of us in the state are hyper aware of what's here. And she talks about in her book, understanding that these were people a couple of decades ago who made a conscious decision that this was going to be a place of culture, that the artists who are here were going to be supported and have markets for their work. And she's telling me about these people, and I'm like, oh my God, it's like a microcosm of what. Then I was like, okay, maybe this is just how it happens. And we've given us this book that I think we can hang so much on. So I want to thank you for the book. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me about it. And for those of you watching this, I am, in reading it, could give you a treasure trove of places to go after this. And I'm sure Hugh could as well. But I just want to thank you all for listening and watching, and pick up this book from the Country Bookshop. Hugh has sent us book plates. So when you can see, mine is all covered with notes, but yours, if you buy it from the Country Bookshop, will have a wonderful book plate signed by Hugh. So thank you very much. And Hugh, is there anything else, as we're at our last minute here, although we did start a few minutes late, but is there anything else you want to touch on or highlight as we conclude?
Well, no, that was just, I really enjoyed this conversation. And I just wanted to say that, I mean, one of the things that I hope comes across here is none of this would have just happened.
Yes.
It required a very specific group of people making specific decisions and being lucky too at various moments. I mean, at every step of the way, it could have gone a different way. And I think that's really part of the excitement of the story, at least for me in working on it, was to discover, it just like the big political conflicts, what would have happened if World War II, we hadn't won World War II, or what would have happened, if events happened differently in at different points in time, or the Great Depression, and all of this. Also,
what would have happened if Conweiler saw World War I going differently?
exactly, yeah, and it's just at so many points in the story, it really was touch and go what would happen. And so I just think that if there's one thing about the book that sort of an overriding theme, that was what it was for me, that it's really, people, these particular characters having this passion that actually in a way changed history, and that was really exciting for me.
I agree with you. I'm starting, just in my own understanding of the world, I'm starting to just really come to a clear conclusion that it's just people deciding to do something. And what you've given us is in highlighting these people we wouldn't know otherwise, who just decided. And now we have modern art in America, and it's a gift. So thank you, Hugh.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye. Oh.